Hans Niemann is playing the tournament of his life so far in Croatia. He is currently on 4.5 out of 5, crushing Grandmaster after Grandmaster like they're all patzers. His performance rating so far is 2,932, which is absolutely insane considering the strong opposition he is facing in this tournament. Now we are all curious to see, how is Hans doing that? Is he playing fair or does he make use of some unfair assistance? We don't know. Maybe handle beats are easy to get in Croatia. That's of course the big discussion. But anyway, let's have a look at the game Hans played in round 5, because it's a very instructive game, but also very entertaining. Let's have a look. He's playing with the white pieces and he came very well prepared for this game. He goes for 1e4 and his opponent is a real expert on the Caro-Kann. So Hans goes for d4, d5, e5, and now the move c5. This is a typical move, of course, to try to challenge the center. White is having a space advantage, but okay, black is playing the pawn to c5 in 2 moves, which of course is a tempo, but he hopes to get a nice position after bringing the bishop out at some point, maybe to f5 or g4, depending on how play will develop in the next couple of moves. But Hans goes for knight f3. Now a move like bishop g4 could be considered, but knight c6 is played, and now d takes c5. White is capturing the pawn on c5, e6. Black is trying to win the pawn back, and here bishop e3. White is not going to cooperate and will hang to the pawn. With this move, the bishop protects the pawn on c5. Now the knight comes to h6. Interesting idea. So the knight can come either to f5 or g4, trading it itself for the bishop on e3. But first, there is the move c3, so that after knight f5, the bishop comes to d4. This is a typical idea in this variation of the Caro-Kann, as whenever black is going to take on d4, white will recapture with the pawn, and the pawn will support the pawn on c5. So black will not be able to regain the pawn. Bishop d7 was played, and now interesting moment, because this tournament of peace was taking place last year as well, and there Zelcic had the same position against the French Grandmaster Moussard, in which white played the move queen d2, but Hans definitely has seen this game and decides to play here the move bishop b5, which is the top choice of the engine. It's a good move, but it gives black the possibility to take the pawn on e5. That's a very interesting moment in the game, because black is winning the pawn back. The idea is that after bishop takes d7, the knight, which is hanging, can just recapture on d7, and that's okay for black, because next the pawn on c5 will be taken probably as well. So instead of taking the bishop on d7, Hans goes for the move knight takes e5, and black captures with the bishop. So now the bishop prevents the white king from castling kingside, and therefore white played here the move a4, questioning this bishop. The bishop went back to d7, and how should we evaluate this position? It's a difficult position with a lot of imbalances. Black has the bishop pair, has extra pawns in the center, but the pawns are nicely blockaded by the bishop on d4 and the knight on e5. There are various ways of proceeding here, but Hans decides to play here the move a5. So the idea is that black can probably never really play a move like b6, trying to regain the pawn on c5, or at least get rid of that pawn. So here, what should black do? Well, a move like bishop e7 looks fairly normal, I would say, but the move a6 was played. Maybe black didn't want white to allow playing a move like a6 himself anytime soon, but I'm not sure. I'm not a fan of this move, and later on, black may face some serious problems with its pawn formation on the queen side. So white castled kingside here. Black goes bishop e7, ready to castle kingside, and now another very interesting move, as white takes with a knight on d7, as depriving black from its bishop pair. Why would you do that? Because this bishop didn't look very impressive at all. Well, I think maybe at some point white would like to get its knight over to e5, but then, okay, there's always this possibility black will kick the knight out with f6. So I don't think things are that simple here, to be honest. Queen takes d7 was played, and now white goes for the move b4. So look at this pawn configuration. It's very impressive. It looks like the game of checkers, and well, definitely black cannot easily contest these pawns. So the big question is, after castling kingside, how is white going to develop its knight? When looking at the game, I was thinking a move like knight a3 with the idea to get a knight to c2 and maybe later to e3. Offering the exchange of knights could be a nice way to get the knight involved. Hans thought differently and went for the move knight to d2. Black played here the move bishop d8 with the idea to put the bishop on c7 very soon. And now the big question is, how is white going to deal with the possible threat of f6 and e5? I was thinking f4 is a logical move. I understand that it's a pawn move close to your king. Maybe it's a weakening move. But the move played by Hans in the game is bishop e5. There is f6, so the bishop gets under attack and the bishop goes back to g3. Why did white move this bishop to g3? Definitely he was fearing that the bishop on d4 would come under threat by the pawn on e5. So the bishop is now on g3. But frankly speaking, I'm not sure the bishop is doing that well on this diagonal. I don't really see what it's going to do now. And if black would play here a move like e5, this bishop is kind of stuck. My plan as black would be to put the bishop on c7, to put the rook on d8. The rooks will connect with each other and support the pawn chain in the center. And with the pawn on e5, the bishop on g3 looks out of play. So instead, Zelcic didn't advance the pawn to e5, but he decided to trade off the knight for the bishop. I understand that in open positions, bishops are usually better than a knight, but I felt that the bishop on g3 was not a good piece, so the exchange definitely surprises me. H takes g3, bishop to c7, and now Hans played a nice move. The knight comes into c4. The knight cannot be taken here, because if you do so, the queen on d7 is hanging. So that's how white improves its knight, making use of the pawn on d5 being pinned. Rook a8, rook protects the queen. Black threatens to take the knight on c4, but the knight comes into b6. So that has been made possible thanks to the fantastic pawns on a5 and c5. The queen went to c6, white puts the rook on e1, putting some pressure against the pawn on e6. Okay, the pawn is still defended, but at some point as black you want to advance your pawn. Well, in the game there followed first this move h6, white played the move queen d3, so also white's pieces are now nicely connected with each other. e5 played, and now another interesting moment, because after advancing the pawn to e5, the pawn on d5 is a bit more vulnerable. You would expect here the move rook a1, but probably Hans decided to take the other rook with the idea that the rook is still useful on a1 to support the pawn formation on the queen side. So here white is threatening to take the pawn on d5. It's now 3 times attacked by queen, rook and knight. Therefore bishop takes b6, pawn takes b6, and look at this situation. If you purely look at the pawn formation, you may think that black's pawn structure is more healthy because white has 3 doubled pawns. 2 doubled pawns on the b file, 2 on the c file, and 2 on the g file. That's very strange. And still, I think white is better because of the pawns on the queen side. Let's see how play develops from here. Rook d7, the queen comes into f5. The queen is very active. Rook e8, rook d2. So white is planning to bring the other rook to the d file at the right moment. Rook e8 was played, and now Hans goes for the move f4. He's putting more pressure against the pawn on e5. If you take with the pawn, there is queen takes f4, and white has made a very good exchange by getting rid of this pawn on e5. Their idea is to put pressure against the pawn on d5, but maybe even better could be at the right moment to take over the initiative via the e file. Anyway, this didn't happen as black didn't go for the exchange. Black played here the move e4. Black has now a protected passed pawn, but white blocks with the rook on d4. That's a very nice and stable move. King went to f7. You may think, what is this king doing there? Well, it's not easy to say what black should do instead. There are not many good pawn moves available at this point. Now, very important moment, as we would expect the rook to come over to d1, finally putting pressure. But Hans didn't play it for a good reason. If you do play this move, black has the move a5. If white would take the pawn on c5 is hanging. Otherwise, black is going to take himself and generate counterplay via the a file perhaps. So white better maintains the rook on a1. There followed queen h5 check. The king went back to f8, and now white has a different plan. He is shifting the attention to the other side of the board with the move g4, planning to go g5 and launch a kingside attack. Black decided, okay, now it's time to bring the queen closer to the center, to the king, and now the queen no longer puts pressure against the pawn on c5. This is the moment to get the rook involved. White is clearly on top, as it seems as if the pawn on d5 needs to remain defended, and white has ideas to play g5 at the right moment. I think black's position is kind of unpleasant. You should probably make a waiting move. That's actually very important. Queen e7 was not played in the game, and the idea is that if you do take on d5, everything gets swapped, and then all of a sudden the e-pawn is very strong. So that's something you should not allow. After rook takes d8, queen takes d8, this e-pawn is much stronger than white's extra pawn, and black has enough counterplay. So queen e7 is a good move. Black should not fear white capturing this pawn on d5. White instead may bring the king to the center or centralize the queen with queen f5. White is better, but will have to work hard to break through. Therefore, Zelcic decided to play differently. He played here the move e3. It's understandable that you're looking for counterplay right away, but now white's pieces are still on the board, very well coordinated, and Hans played this move, queen f5. That's an excellent decision. If black would swap the queens, then the e-pawn is now much more vulnerable. The simple plan is to get the king in front of the pawn, put a rook on d3, wrap up the pawn, and it's a technical win for white. This didn't happen. Queen e7 was played, so the queen stays on the board, but now the rook comes to e1 to attack the pawn on e3. Okay, pawn is still defended, but no longer by its pawn. So black is very passive with its pieces, and I really don't know what these pieces are going to do in the next couple of moves. a5 is played, looking for counterplay. If you take on a5, it's queen takes c5. Anyway, Hans is not interested in such a pawn. He goes for the attack with the move g5. Excellent idea. Pawn takes b4 was played, and now is white going to take back? No way. G takes h6. That is the key move. And it's very important, by the way, to point out that black decided not to take earlier on g5, because after f takes g5, the rook has the possibility to swing over to the h file, for instance. So a before g takes h6. If black recaptures with the pawn, it's c takes b4. And look at this king, it's wide open. Pawn is vulnerable. So many attacking prospects here for white. This looks just great. So after g takes h6, Zelcic played pawn takes c3, keeping this pawn on the board on h6. So white goes h7, threatening to promote the pawn to a queen, and that will be winning the game for white. So king f7 was played. The rook controls the promotion square, but now it's queen h5 check. The king cannot go back to the 8th rank because of the promotion. So g6 is played, and it looks like a nice counterattack. If you get a new queen, black can simply take on h5, and it's far from clear. But look what Hans did here. This happened in the real game. This is so exciting. He just didn't move the queen, but he promoted its pawn. Minor promotion. Knight promotes. Check. Beautiful idea. King g7. And now the queen is hanging. The knight is hanging, but there is knight takes g6. So the knight is saved. The knight can always be protected. By the way, the knight is attacking the queen. Queen takes c5 was played, attacking the rook. If the rook would have to move, maybe there are counter-attacking ideas with black's pawns in the center. But look at this cute idea. Knight h4, the knight goes away, so that after queen takes d4, there is knight f5 check, and white wins the queen. That's just game over. So after king g8, the knight goes to f5 to protect the rook on d4, and black's counterplay is not very impressive. There followed c2, there's a queen check on g6, king h8, queen captures the pawn with check, king g8, another check is played. Now the king went to f8. I mean, you can also go to h8. But after queen f6, king g8, there are many ways to convert. You can just play rook c1. Everything is protected. You can play for mate or just wrap up the pawns with a knight taking on e3 and then rook takes c2, for instance. That's just game over. But there followed king f8. And now the finishing touch here is knight h6. That's a very cute idea. Black resigned here because the rook can just not be taken. If you do so, there is this move, queen to g8, king e7. And now it's knight f5. With a knight fork, you're about to win the queen. The king can still go to f6. Now you better don't take the queen immediately as black captures the rook. But instead there is queen g5 check. And now after the king goes away, you take the queen on d4 and it's just game over. I thought this was a very impressive game, and Hans is now on 4.5 out of 5, having an almost 3000 performance. Let's see how he is going to play in the next couple of rounds. What do you think of this game? Is Hans really that strong? Are his opponents really bad? Or is he cheating again? Well, judging from this game, I feel Hans is playing fair and square, very impressively, but I'm curious to hear from you, your thoughts, and if you do so, also click on the subscribe button to see more of Hans's games.